Hey guys, tonight we wander into a palace that's alive in the quietest ways, where walls seem to listen and shadows don't just fall, they linger, whispering in corners. You probably won't survive this whole story without at least one shiver running down your spine. But that's kind of the point. Imagine silk carpets muffling your footsteps, candle flames flickering as if in conversation with something unseen, and corridors stretching longer than they logically should. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, post your location and local time. I love seeing where the night finds you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past golden doors inlaid with lapis lazuli, the scent of jasmine curling around the air like smoke from a quiet fire. Outside, the desert stretches endlessly, yet inside, every room seems to pulse with its own rhythm, like it has a heartbeat. Historians still argue whether the kings of old employed psychological tricks with architecture to impress or intimidate their guests, but tonight, you don't need any studies to feel it. Somewhere above, a crescent moon spills pale light across mosaic tiles, casting jagged shadows that slither like curious cats. One catches your attention, tall and thin, and for a fleeting second, it seems almost human, bowing before a throne that isn't yours. The king, a man of stern eyes and long fingers, walks ahead without noticing you. His reputation is whispered across lands, a sovereign who speaks with shadows, who listens not only to ministers but to the dark, lingering forms that gather in corners. Fringe scholars suggest he might be channeling something older than the palace itself, some pre-Islamic magic that survived in whispers and worn tiles. In the great hall, you glimpse tapestries embroidered with forgotten stories. One shows a lion with a crown of stars, another a serpent whose shadow coils into a doorway. And you realize the imagery isn't decoration, it's communication, encoded for those who can hear shadows. A servant tiptoes by, carrying a tray of sweet dates, their sugar sheen catching the candlelight. You try not to giggle at the incongruity. Here you are, in the most haunted palace imaginable, and someone worries about sticky fingerprints. Yet, the king pauses mid-step, his gaze fixed on a dark corner where nothing should be. His voice is low but steady. Tell me what the wind whispers tonight. The air seems to twitch, and for the first time, you hear it. Tiny murmurs, half-formed words, as if the shadows themselves have started a conversation. As you follow him, you notice details you'd normally overlook. A cracked mosaic reveals a hidden symbol, a tiny golden bird perched where a tile is chipped. Historians still argue whether these symbols were protective sigils or mere artistic flair, but tonight, they feel like breadcrumbs leading you deeper into the palace's mysteries. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of saffron drifts past, reminding you that the palace isn't just a place, it's a story, written in sound, smell, and the tremor of shadows. And then there's the first whisper aimed at you. Not the king, not the servant, but something softer, a syllable that brushes your ear like a secret. Welcome. You swallow hard, shadows rarely speak, and yet here you are, hearing one. In that instant, you understand the odd reality of this night. Nothing is quite what it seems. Even the gold-framed mirrors lining the corridor seem to wink at you, reflecting not just your face but something else, something patient and watchful. Fringe historians debate whether the king ever truly heard shadows, or simply trained himself to notice subtle human cues. But you don't have time for debate. You have the palpable, tickling certainty of the uncanny brushing against your skin. By the time you reach the central hall, the king kneels before a great obsidian statue, a serpent coiling around a crescent moon. Shadows cling to the figure as though they recognize an old friend. The murmuring grows, weaving in and out of the marble columns, rising and falling like wind through a canyon. You shiver, not from cold, but from understanding. Tonight, you aren't just visiting a palace, you're threading yourself into a story where every step, every glance carries meaning, and as your eyes adjust, you see a shadow separate from its source, stretching toward the king, bowing and waiting for instructions. Outside, the desert sleeps under a canopy of stars, oblivious to the magic that bends time and perception inside these walls. You feel the pull of exhaustion, that gentle tug that reminds you you're still human, not a shadow. Yet something in the palace compels you forward. Curiosity prying your eyelids open, heart pacing quietly with anticipation. And somewhere in that mix of fear and wonder, you sense the first stirrings of a question that will haunt you all night. What does it truly mean to speak with shadows? You follow the king as he drifts silently down a moonlit corridor, the polished stone reflecting his every step in shimmering duplicate. The cool tiles are slick beneath your sandals, and the faint scent of rosewater mingles with dust, creating an aroma both comforting and unsettling. Outside, the desert is a void of stars and silence, but inside, the palace hums with subtle life, the distant drip of water from a fountain, the rustle of silk curtains, the whisper of footsteps that aren't yours. You probably wouldn't survive this unnoticed if anyone else were here. Courtiers, guards, servants. But tonight, the corridors seem only to belong to the king and his peculiar habit of roaming after dark. He pauses before a grand archway, arching like the crescent moon itself, and lowers his voice. "Listen," he murmurs, and you strain to catch the sound, but it's more feeling than hearing, a gentle vibration, like the pulse of the palace itself. Fringe scholars suggest that certain ancient rulers believed nighttime wandering heightened intuition, letting them commune with spirits or, more skeptically, their own subconscious. You feel the pulse through your feet and spine, a subtle rhythm that makes the hall feel alive in ways that daylight could never convey. Historians still argue whether these nightly rituals were sincere or clever, psychological theatre to consolidate power. But for now, the palace itself seems like a living entity responding to his presence. Shadows flicker along the walls as torches sway, though no breeze disturbs the air. One seems to detach itself from a statue of a crouching lion, stretching its limbs like a cat waking from a nap. You start to notice patterns. The shadows lean toward him, brush against corners, and curl around objects in ways that defy logic. They whisper not just secrets of the court, but of the people in the city beyond the palace gates, of merchants and thieves, of lovers and spies. You can almost hear the distant clang of a smith hammering iron, the laughter of children chasing one another through dusty streets, all carried faintly by the shifting darkness. The king moves with a careful, deliberate grace, one hand trailing along an ornate banister. He pauses at a small door tucked behind a tapestry depicting a desert caravan. "Few know this place exists," he says, his eyes glinting with a mixture of mischief and seriousness. Inside is a narrow staircase winding downward, the air growing cooler, tinged with a faint metallic tang. You notice tiny runes etched into the stone walls, some resembling letters, others indecipherable squiggles, and your curiosity spikes. Fringe historians claim these were protective symbols, meant to ward off evil spirits, or maybe just decorative. Either way, their presence makes the space feel sacred, secret, and slightly dangerous all at once. You stumble slightly over a worn step, and the king's gaze flicks toward you, sharp yet unreadable. "Steady," he says, but there's a hint of amusement in his tone. Shadows stretch alongside the staircase, anticipating your every move. One lingers close, brushing your shoulder, and you have the unnerving sense it's guiding you rather than threatening. The air smells faintly of old ink and lavender, the odd combination oddly comforting, almost like a library you've wandered into by accident. Historians still debate whether the king's shadow communion was real magic or merely highly trained observation. But standing here, with a hand trailing along the cold wall and a whisper brushing your ear, it feels entirely believable. At the bottom, a stone corridor opens into a vaulted hall. Moonlight filters through narrow slits, and shadows spill like ink across the polished floor. The king kneels, murmuring words you don't understand, and a long, thin shadow detaches from the wall, flickering like flame. You realize it's responding to him, bowing, circling, almost like a living assistant. Fringe accounts suggest these movements were choreographed, perhaps a type of shadow puppetry lost to time, but you don't care. You can see it clearly, moving with eerie intelligence, almost daring you to question reality. You trudge closer, heart thumping gently, noticing minute details, the veins in the marble, the flicker of torchlight reflecting in a small pool of water, the faint hum of some unseen resonance. The king's voice, low and steady, seems to blend with the shadow's whispers, creating a strange harmony that makes the hair on your neck stand on end. Even the faint rustle of your own clothing feels amplified, as if the palace itself is listening, cataloguing, absorbing. And yet, there's comfort in it too. The sense that you're not entirely alone, that you're witnessing something rare, secret, and alive. Then he speaks again, softer, almost to himself. Tonight, we see who walks in darkness and who fears the light. You sense this is more than a metaphor. The palace, the shadows, the king himself, it all hinges on perception. You realize that curiosity has drawn you here, but respect, caution, and maybe a touch of fear will keep you alive until dawn. As the hall swallows your footsteps, you know the night is only beginning, and the shadows have many stories left to tell. The shadows move differently now, more deliberate, more insistent, as if aware that you are paying attention. You trudge carefully along the polished marble, feeling the slight give of rugs woven with golden threads underfoot. The king glances at you, his expression unreadable, and you realize you're no longer merely an observer. You are part of this midnight ritual, woven into a fabric of whispers and light. Shadows stretch across arches and columns, gathering in corners as if holding counsel. Fringe scholars claim that some royal courts in the medieval Islamic world experimented with forms of shadow play to influence public perception. Historians still argue whether these were simple theatrics or early psychological experiments. Either way, standing here, you can sense the weight of invisible hands guiding your perception. You follow the king into a circular chamber where shadows seem to detach entirely from their objects, twisting and curling into shapes that remind you of animals, mythical creatures, and sometimes even vaguely human silhouettes. A faint chill brushes your neck, and you wonder whether it is the desert night seeping through hidden vents or something older, something less tangible. A faintly humorous thought crosses your mind. If one of these shadows decided to trip you, would anyone notice until morning? You suppress a nervous giggle, careful not to break the spell. The king kneels before a low pedestal and murmurs phrases that curl like smoke into the chamber. One shadow lifts its form fully, elongating into a narrow figure that seems to bow before him. You notice that the shadow's movements are intricate, precise, almost rehearsed. Historians still debate whether medieval rulers actually believed in the sentience of shadows, or whether they were guided by advisors skilled in optical illusions and subtle stagecraft. Fringe accounts suggest some believed these dark companions could convey warnings from the unseen world, whispering about betrayal, fortune, or the intentions of distant lands. Tonight, as you watch, it feels entirely possible. You trudge closer, your curiosity almost outweighing your caution. The king gestures subtly, and the shadow reacts instantly, folding into shapes you can barely comprehend. It seems to offer advice, or perhaps challenge the king, a silent dialogue that plays out in curves and angles of darkness. You catch snippets of movement across the room, A shadow curls around a statue of a griffin, while another stretches over a tapestry depicting a caravan journeying across the desert. Each motion seems deliberate, meaningful, yet indecipherable to anyone not attuned to the palace's hidden language. A faint draught wafts in, carrying with it the scent of sandalwood and old parchment. You notice tiny markings on the floor, barely visible under the moonlight, and realize they correspond to the shadow's positions, as though a secret map is being traced out with ephemeral ink. Fringe historians suggest some kings maintained secret shadow maps for court intrigue, political maneuvering, or even esoteric studies, while skeptics argue that we may be overreading artistic flourishes. You can feel the tension between belief and skepticism pressing against your skin. The king's shadow pauses suddenly, and you freeze as well. It stretches toward a darkened alcove, curling around a small golden chest, then retracts. You can hear the subtle scrape of its movement on the floor, a sound almost imperceptible, but impossible to ignore in the chamber's stillness. You remember tales of courtiers who claimed their own shadows whispered secrets during midnight audiences. Some dismissed them as illusions. Others swore they carried prophecies. Tonight, it seems all those stories converge, forming a narrative you're living rather than hearing about. A soft flicker of torchlight dances across the walls, and you notice something even stranger. The shadows sometimes mimic the movements of those not present. The king gestures with a hand, and a shadow twitches in perfect symmetry with his command. But you also glimpse a flicker that seems independent, a fleeting gesture that belongs to no one. Fringe scholars posit that some rulers cultivated such illusions to instill awe and loyalty among their subjects. Historians still argue whether these were mechanical tricks or the result of genuine arcane knowledge. Either way, the room feels alive, pulsing with intent and intelligence. You realize the shadows are not just passive reflections of light. They have personalities, moods, even whims. One hovers near the pedestal, curling inquisitively, while another stretches toward the far end of the chamber, brushing against the carved walls as if testing their boundaries. The king watches patiently, occasionally whispering instructions, occasionally pausing to let them converse among themselves. You can't tell if the shadows respond to him or the other way around. A slight smile crosses your lips. You feel like a participant in a secret court of beings you never imagined existed. Somewhere in the distance, a soft wind rattles the latticed windows, and you can hear the faint clink of metal from a servant unseen. The whispers of the shadows continue, half audible, half imagined, forming patterns that tease your mind. Historians still argue whether these whispered secrets were intended to inform governance or merely amuse the king, but you sense a deeper truth. The shadows are the palace's memory, retaining knowledge both mundane and mystical, revealing it only to those who truly listen. The king rises slowly, his hand brushing over the pedestal, and the shadows respond with a low, curling dance. You trudge backwards slightly, afraid of breaking the fragile rhythm, afraid of being noticed. The air smells faintly of smoke and crushed rose petals, a combination simultaneously soothing and disquieting. You start to understand the palace's secret. It is not simply a place of stone and gold, but a living organism, and the shadows are its nerves and sinews, communicating in a language older than memory. A faint laugh escapes you, soft, startled, entirely human, and the king's shadow twitches in acknowledgement, as if amused. You remember fringe tales of kings whose shadows acted independently, sometimes betraying secrets, sometimes guiding rulers toward fortune. Historians still argue whether these accounts were metaphorical, exaggerated, or literal. You don't care. You have witnessed a shadow respond to a living being with intent and precision, and that is enough. By the time you trudge to the chamber's centre, the king is seated, meditating in a posture that seems to summon silence itself. The shadows hover around him like attentive students, some mimicking his posture, others swaying in counterpoint. You notice details you had overlooked before. The faint shimmer of moonlight on carved tiles, the tiny scratches in the stone floor marking past rituals, the almost imperceptible hum of the palace's resonance. The experience is dizzying, exhilarating, and slightly terrifying. And then you realise the shadows do not merely echo the king, they speak for him, argue with him, perhaps even correct him. A low, flickering murmur rises from the darkness, shaping itself into a cadence you almost understand. Fringe scholars suggest this may have been an early form of coded communication, while historians still argue whether the king's abilities were supernatural or highly trained. Tonight, you're witnessing it firsthand, and your disbelief wavers. In that suspended moment, the palace seems to hold its breath. You feel your heartbeat echo against the walls, the scent of lavender and burnt oil filling your lungs. One shadow floats close, brushing your sleeve, as if to remind you you're part of the story now. The king glances at you, expression unreadable, and you understand the first true rule of this midnight court. In the presence of shadows, everything you think you know about reality is negotiable. You trudge toward the palace gates, where the heavy bronze doors glimmer faintly in the moonlight. A solitary figure waits, cloaked and hooded, as if emerging from the desert itself. The king stops, glancing at you briefly before lowering his gaze to the stranger. There's a hush in the courtyard, broken only by the distant clatter of a merchant's cart far below the walls. You feel a chill, partly from the night air, partly from the tension radiating between the king and this unexpected guest. Fringe historians suggest that wandering storytellers or travellers sometimes held influence over rulers, delivering news and omens in ways that could shape entire courts. Historians still argue whether these meetings were routine or deliberately dramatised for political effect. Either way, the night feels electric, as though you are witnessing a collision of destinies. The stranger bows low, voice soft but clear. I come bearing tales, and perhaps truths that even the shadows cannot hold. The king tilts his head slightly, motioning for you to stay back, though you edge closer anyway. The figure removes the hood, revealing a weathered face framed by a tangled beard, eyes glinting with intelligence, and maybe mischief. You notice the faint scent of spices and sand carried from faraway markets, the faint rattle of coins hidden in the folds of a sash. There's a peculiar energy about him, one that suggests he might know more than he should, or at least more than the king wishes the court to know. The stranger gestures toward the moonlit palace, and for a moment, you swear the shadows quiver in recognition. I have wandered lands where shadows speak louder than men, he says. The king narrows his eyes. And what would you have me do with that knowledge? He replies, voice low, measured. Fringe scholars speculate that tales of wandering seers influencing monarchs might have inspired literary legends, while historians still argue whether these stories reflect actual events or literary embellishments. Standing here, you can't help but believe some combination of both. You notice details others might miss. A small bird perched silently on a fountain edge, its head tilting as if listening. The subtle shift of shadows from the walls to the floor, as though they're eavesdropping. The faint gleam of a dagger tucked beneath the stranger's cloak. More precaution than threat. The air is alive with tension, yet also a strange camaraderie, the kind that only forms between those who recognise something extraordinary in one another. You feel both excited and slightly nervous. You're witnessing an intersection of the mundane and the magical. The king steps forward, and you sense a subtle dance between authority and curiosity. "Show me what you have learned," he says, gesturing toward the stranger. In response, the traveller unrolls a parchment so old it seems brittle under moonlight, the edges curling like desert sand dunes. Faint symbols and diagrams cover it, some almost laughably whimsical. Tiny sketches of creatures with elongated limbs, stars arranged in improbable constellations. But you realise the images are more than decorative. They're instructions, stories, prophecies, or warnings. Fringe accounts suggest some rulers used coded illustrations to communicate sensitive information. Historians still argue whether such codes were practical or purely symbolic. The king examines the parchment closely, fingers brushing over the faded ink, and you notice a shadow nearby detach entirely from the wall, hovering over the paper as though reading along. You shiver slightly. If these shadows are assistants, messengers, or advisors, you wonder whether they also judge, evaluate, or even debate in ways no human witness could detect. The stranger speaks again, recounting tales from faraway cities, whispering about merchants, thieves, and armies, all linked by a thread of intelligence only the shadows seem to grasp. You realize the palace is not merely a home or fortress. It is a hub of information, surveillance, and hidden networks that stretch far beyond the courtyard. The king leans back, eyes narrowing in thought, and you notice the faintest twitch of his shadow, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that something is amiss. "You've wandered far, stranger," he says, voice tinged with curiosity and caution. "And yet, the desert brings you to my gate for a reason." The stranger inclines his head, acknowledging both the truth and the subtle challenge. A faint breeze stirs, and you hear the soft rustle of a tapestry behind you, shadows flickering as if they, too, are listening intently. You trudge closer, drawn by the gravity of this midnight audience. The stranger reveals a map, folded and creased with age, showing outposts, caravan routes, and hidden passages that the king may or may not have known existed. Fringe scholars claim that such maps were treasured for intelligence purposes. Historians still argue whether these were military secrets or mystical artifacts. You realize that every line, symbol, and annotation could shift the balance of power not just in this palace, but across the surrounding lands. A faint laugh escapes the king, soft and unexpected. "So, the shadows whisper of truths even I have not imagined," he murmurs, glancing at the hovering shapes around him. The stranger smiles, a faint glint of amusement in his eyes. You can feel the tension between knowledge and secrecy pressing in, an invisible current that makes the courtyard feel both vast and claustrophobic. The desert beyond the walls is silent, oblivious to the exchange taking place within these illuminated gates. By the time the discussion winds down, the king and the stranger have reached a silent understanding, though what has been decided remains partly concealed in shadow. You notice the faint shimmer of moonlight on the palace stones, the rustle of leaves in a distant courtyard, the subtle rise and fall of shadows that seem to linger just a heartbeat longer than expected. You trudge back along the marble floor, realizing that this encounter has shifted the night's rhythm, and that the shadows have absorbed new stories, new secrets, ready to whisper them to those who know how to listen. You trudge through a side corridor, leaving the courtyard and the stranger's departing figure behind. The air shifts subtly here, scented faintly of citrus and warm stone, and you realize you've entered the palace's hidden sand gardens, small, carefully maintained courtyards with patterned dunes and miniature oases. The moonlight spills over tiny raked ridges, casting delicate shadows that ripple like liquid. You probably won't notice the faint whisper of wind moving over sand unless you're paying attention, but tonight, every shift seems to speak. Fringe historians suggest such gardens were used not only for meditation, but also for encoding secret messages through their design. Historians still argue whether these patterns held practical significance or were symbolic flourishes of aesthetic obsession. You kneel briefly to examine the sand, noticing intricate spirals and tiny symbols drawn into the surface. Some resemble stars, others appear like abstract animals frozen mid-leap. The shadows here, detached from walls and trees, bend and twist over the patterns, tracing invisible lines only the king can interpret. You watch a shadow curl around a crescent design, pausing as if confirming its alignment. It's strangely mesmerizing. Fringe accounts claim that kings trained certain shadows to convey messages or track events using these sand patterns. You wonder how much of this is ritual, and how much is the palace itself actively teaching its ruler. The king moves deliberately along the paths, tracing his fingers over the ridges without disturbing the delicate arrangements. You notice that each motion seems to correspond to a flicker of shadow, sometimes an arc, sometimes a curl, as if the gardens and their caretakers are performing a subtle ballet. A small fountain burbles quietly nearby, its water reflecting the moonlight and shimmering patterns of the sand like liquid stars. Historians still argue whether these miniature landscapes were merely ornamental or encoded complex philosophical or tactical information. You lean closer, sensing that the answer may lie in the shadows more than the sand itself. A gentle laugh escapes you, soft and uncertain, as a shadow glides past, brushing against your shoulder in a manner almost teasing. One of the raked lines in the sand seems deliberately misaligned, a slight deviation in the otherwise precise pattern. The king pauses and lowers his hand, studying the irregularity with faint interest. Fringe scholars suggest such subtle errors were deliberate, meant to mark events, people, or secret warnings in a silent language only a few could read. You glance around, realizing that the gardens are less about plants or water than communication, a medium where the desert, the palace, and the shadows intersect. You trudge toward a hidden pavilion at the garden centre, small lanterns casting soft pools of light. Inside, tiny inscriptions on the walls depict serpents, stars, and abstract symbols, some familiar, others utterly alien. The king kneels beside a shallow basin of water, letting a shadow drift over the surface, the reflection bending and warping like liquid ink. Fringe accounts note that some royal shadow rituals involved water as a conduit for divination. Historians still argue whether this practice was mystical, psychological, or a blend of both. You find yourself holding your breath, aware that even a faint exhale could break the delicate cadence of this ritual. From the pavilion, you can see the palace walls, their heights softened by the moon. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale sings, the sound crisp and strangely out of place amid the desert hush. The king murmurs words you cannot understand, and shadows ripple over the sand, forming transient images, small animals, abstract sigils, and a faint shape that looks like a ship gliding through water. You can't be sure if it is intended as a warning or simply an artistic flourish. Fringe historians debate whether such nightly displays were purely symbolic or carried practical information. You don't care, because the motion, the sound, and the scent create a story you can almost touch. You kneel near a ridge in the sand, noticing tiny footprints, some human, some seemingly impossible, like the prints of an animal you have never seen. The shadows curl around them protectively, almost reverently. The king traces a finger along one of the prints, tilting his head slightly, and you feel that you're intruding on something sacred. Fringe accounts suggest that rulers sometimes left encoded messages in natural materials, sand, water, or even smoke, to communicate across distances or time. Historians still argue whether these methods were practical, mystical, or theatrical, but tonight it feels like both truth and spectacle intertwined. A faint breeze lifts the scent of crushed mint and cedar from nearby planters, carrying it through the garden. You watch the king's shadow stretch over the carefully raked lines, seemingly merging with the sand itself. You feel your own shadow shift in response, though logic tells you it's impossible. The palace, the sand, the shadows, they are communicating, and you are reading the language imperfectly, breathlessly, as though learning an unfamiliar musical notation. You realize that every ridge, curves, and curl is deliberate, a story in miniature performed nightly, witnessed by few. The king steps back from the pavilion, brushing sand from his robes, and for the first time glances directly at you. His expression is inscrutable, a mixture of amusement and something else, curiosity, perhaps, or a test. A shadow flits ahead of him, outlining a pattern that stretches across the garden like a bridge. Fringe scholars claim such practices were used for meditation and strategic planning. Historians still argue whether any real messages were ever encoded. You, however, know that this moment, the moonlight, the sand, and the shadows together form a lesson in observation, patience, and awe. By the time you rise, brushing sand from your clothes, you feel a quiet reverence. The night has grown deeper, yet lighter in meaning. Every flicker, every curve of shadow, every pattern in the sand carries weight, knowledge, and the promise of more revelations. The palace is alive, and you're only beginning to understand how it speaks. You trudge back along the pathways, careful not to disturb the delicate balance, already sensing that the shadows have recorded your presence, catalogued your attention, and will whisper about it long after you leave. You trudge back toward the palace's inner halls, feeling the cool marble beneath your feet and the subtle brush of shadows along the walls. A faint echo of laughter drifts from an unseen balcony, mingling with the soft murmur of water from distant fountains. The king moves ahead with quiet purpose. But tonight the palace feels more like a theatre than a home, the shadows performing, the moonlight acting as spotlight. He pauses before a wide hall where scholars and sages are gathered, their robes rustling like wind through reeds, heads bent over scrolls and charts. You probably won't survive this without noticing the tension. Some are here to learn, others to question, and a few may even be secretly amused. So you edge closer, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the room. The hall is dimly lit, torches casting flickering light over stacks of manuscripts and maps spread across long tables. The air is thick with incense, cedar and myrrh, and you notice the faint metallic tang of ink and old parchment. Scholars whisper to each other in hushed tones, voices blending into a soft, continuous hum. Fringe accounts suggest that medieval rulers often held debates late at night, interpreting omens or strategizing military campaigns under the cover of darkness. Historians still argue whether these sessions were truly analytical or more ceremonial. Tonight, you sense both, a delicate balance of intellect and ritual. The king steps to the center of the hall, shadow stretching across the floor in long, curling tendrils. One scholar, older and stooped, lifts a scroll and gestures toward a complex diagram of celestial constellations. "Your Majesty," he murmurs. The alignment of stars this month suggests unusual movement among the northern provinces. The king listens, nodding slowly, his shadow responding almost as if agreeing with or questioning the observation. Fringe historians propose that shadow communication may have been used for conveying subtle cues to subordinates, while historians still debate whether these cues were symbolic, theatrical, or mystical. You trudge closer, fascinated by the interplay of knowledge and power. The discussion grows more animated, voices rising slightly as the night deepens. A younger scholar, bright-eyed and eager, points to a small illustration of a mythical beast etched into a manuscript. "We have records of creatures said to mimic human behaviour," she exclaims. The older scholars murmur in agreement or disagreement, some chuckling quietly. You stifle a smile, imagine a mythical creature critiquing your work, but the king watches silently, his gaze calm and deliberate. Fringe accounts claim rulers sometimes encouraged imaginative discourse to sharpen critical thinking. Historians still argue whether this was truly educational or subtly performative. You notice subtle movements of the shadows as the debate continues. A shadow flits along the ceiling, elongating to underline a scholar's point. Another curls around the leg of a table, waiting to interject in its silent language. You realize the shadows are part of the debate too, almost like invisible moderators or participants. The king's own shadow stretches, then folds in on itself, creating shapes that underscore or contradict the spoken words. Fringe scholars suggest this was a conscious manipulation of perception to maintain authority. Historians still argue whether the shadows were tools, symbols, or something more supernatural. Tonight, you can see clearly that the king has mastered all three. A soft breeze drifts through the open balcony doors, carrying the scent of jasmine and distant desert sand. You notice the flicker of candlelight across the walls, making shadows quiver, twist, and shimmer as if alive. One scholar leans closer to the king, whispering a conjecture about the shadow's behaviour, and you catch the edge of doubt in his voice. Historians still argue whether the king's interactions with shadows were genuine communication, clever optics, or a psychological manipulation. Fringe accounts claim that shadows sometimes relayed warnings about political rivals or enemies, silent allies in a world of intrigue. You realise the importance of observation, timing, and subtlety in this court. The debate reaches its peak when a scholar questions the legitimacy of the king's shadow rituals. Your Majesty, are we certain these shadows serve purpose, or are they simply reflections of human expectation? The king leans forward, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His shadow responds instantly, elongating dramatically, folding back and curling around the scholar's scroll as if emphasizing the king's unspoken rebuttal. Fringe historians suggest that the king's shadow may have been trained to respond in visual shorthand. Historians still argue whether it was purely technique or something beyond explanation. You feel the thrill of witnessing a conversation where spoken words and shadows converse simultaneously. You trudge closer to the edge of the hall, noticing the interplay of light, movement, and sound. The faint hum of torches blends with whispered arguments, the rustle of robes, and the quiet shuffle of feet. A scholar adjusts his spectacles, glancing nervously at the shadows, while another leans back, smirking faintly at the subtle performance unfolding. You catch yourself, holding your breath, caught between curiosity and reverence. Fringe accounts describe similar gatherings as intense psychological exercises. Historians still argue whether these exercises were intended to strengthen intellect or demonstrate control. Tonight, you feel both. Every word, every gesture, every flicker of shadow a lesson in subtle power. By the time the debate winds down, a sense of calm settles over the hall. The king stands, silent, surveying the scholars and shadows alike. He gestures once, and the shadows respond with small arcs, curls, and nods of acknowledgement, as if closing a chapter of conversation. You trudge back toward the corridor, heart still pounding from the intensity, realizing that the night has already imparted lessons you weren't consciously seeking: observation, patience, and the understanding that power often resides as much in perception as in action. You trudge quietly down another corridor, the marble cool beneath your feet, the faint scent of old ink and parchment trailing the king like a secret signature. Ahead, a large, dust-choked doorway yawns open, revealing the forgotten library, a room so vast that even moonlight struggles to illuminate the farthest shelves. You probably won't survive this exploration without sneezing from centuries of dust, but the air carries a faint whisper of knowledge, the tang of old paper, and something else, something almost magical. Fringe historians claim that hidden libraries in medieval palaces stored not only texts, but coded instructions for shadow rituals or political maneuverings. Historians still argue whether these rooms were intentionally secret or simply neglected. Tonight, you see both possibilities. The king steps forward, brushing a hand along a carved shelf, releasing a tiny cascade of dust motes that glitter like stars. Shadows seem to curl along the shelves, twisting to reveal hidden alcoves and compartments that you would have missed otherwise. One shadow stretches over a pile of rolled scrolls, moving as if selecting a particular manuscript. You feel the hum of anticipation, the sense that each document carries stories, secrets, or warnings that have long been forgotten or never meant for human eyes. Fringe accounts suggest that some rulers kept obscure texts deliberately misleading, a sort of intellectual camouflage. Historians still debate whether the text's true purpose was practical, mystical, or performative. You trudge closer to a small reading alcove, noticing marginalia scrawled in nearly illegible script along the edges of a massive codex. The words are a mix of dry notes and whimsical drawings: a camel wearing a crown, a tiny sun with arms, a serpentine figure pointing at constellations. Fringe historians propose these marginal doodles were either mnemonic devices or secret codes. Historians still argue whether they contained real knowledge or were mere artistic flourishes. You pause, running your fingers lightly over the parchment, and feel the delicate pulse of centuries beneath your touch. The king kneels beside a low table, arranging several manuscripts in a deliberate order. One is a book of astronomical charts, another a treatise on the behaviour of desert winds, and a third a curious collection of allegorical tales. Shadows drift over each document, curling around diagrams and figures, almost as if interpreting the texts themselves. You notice a faint shimmer of light reflecting off tiny ink particles, creating miniature constellations on the table surface. Fringe accounts suggest that kings use shadows as active participants in reading and interpreting esoteric texts. Historians still argue whether this was literal or metaphorical. You can't help but marvel at the intimacy between ruler and shadow. A sudden movement draws your gaze upward. A shadow stretches across a high, arched ceiling, curling into the shape of a crescent moon. You notice a tiny figure etched into the cornice, a small man riding a winged beast, and realise that the shadows are tracing, or perhaps responding to, the symbols. Fringe scholars claim that some medieval rulers treated architecture and decor as interactive texts, encoding knowledge and guidance within spatial design. Historians still debate whether such practices were esoteric instruction or clever ornamentation. You lean closer, fascinated, aware that even your presence may alter the shadow's interpretations. The king lifts a manuscript, revealing delicate illustrations of mythical creatures. One page depicts a lion with serpentine legs, another a bird whose shadow stretches beyond its drawn wings. Shadows gather around the table, elongating to follow the figures, pausing at each curve and curl as if reading along. Fringe accounts suggest that shadow-guided reading allowed rulers to glean insights missed by ordinary eyes. Historians still argue whether this was a practical method or a form of ceremonial pageantry. You feel your own shadow shift reflexively, as though acknowledging the interplay between light, ink, and darkness. You trudge toward a tall shelf, running your fingers along the spines of dusty tomes. Some books are bound in dark leather, embossed with faint symbols you cannot decipher, others are wrapped in faded cloth. A faint hum seems to rise from the floor itself, vibrating gently through your sandals. Fringe historians propose that certain palaces were deliberately constructed with resonant floors to enhance the reading of incantations or whispered texts. Historians still debate whether this was intentional or coincidental. You take a deep breath, aware that every footstep may ripple through centuries of accumulated knowledge. From the far end of the library, a small fountain trickles softly, its water catching faint moonlight and scattering it across the walls. You notice a shadow curl over the basin, forming a shape that mimics the flow of water, almost like a living diagram. The king traces patterns with his finger, whispering instructions to his unseen companion. Fringe accounts suggest that shadows might have been trained to highlight textual cues, annotate diagrams silently, or act as guides for interpretation. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were mystical, psychological, or theatrical. You realise that each page turned is a conversation not only between king and text, but between shadows and history itself. A delicate scroll catches your eye, almost hidden behind larger manuscripts. You unroll it carefully, revealing strange geometric shapes and symbols, spirals, triangles, and stars intertwined with faint sketches of animals and tiny human figures. The shadows hover close, brushing against certain sections as though approving or correcting what they perceive. Fringe scholars suggest that shadow-guided learning could encode knowledge in ways imperceptible to casual observers. Historians still debate whether the king relied on the shadows or if it was a theatrical display to impress courtiers. You lean closer, captivated, feeling the room's quiet pulse. By the time you rise, brushing dust from your sleeves, the library feels alive with possibilities. Shadows curl around corners and shelves, guiding, interpreting, and perhaps even judging the information. The king rises, and you realize this room has taught you something intangible. That knowledge, when combined with perception, ritual, and attentive observation, becomes more than information, it becomes experience. You trudge back toward the hall, carrying the faint scent of ink, sand, and candle wax, aware that the forgotten library has left its impression, whispered in shadows, waiting to be recalled in the quietest moments of the night. You trudge along a narrow spiral staircase that winds downward beneath the library, the air growing cooler and tinged with the earthy scent of damp stone. Moonlight filters through small, high windows, throwing long, angular shadows that stretch across the walls like sentinels. The king leads, silent and steady, and you follow, noticing the faint scuff marks on the stone steps from centuries of midnight wanderers. Fringe historians suggest that hidden sublevels beneath palaces were often used for secret councils, alchemical experiments, or archival storage. Historians still argue whether these areas were practical or symbolic, reserved for select eyes only. You probably won't survive the climb unnoticed if anyone else were present. But tonight, the stairs belong to you, the king, and the shadows. At the bottom, you enter a low-ceilinged chamber, lined with shelves of glass jars, copper instruments, and rolled parchment sealed with wax. The faint metallic tang of chemicals mixes with the dusty aroma of old parchment, creating a scent both strange and strangely comforting. You notice faint burn marks on the stone floor, concentric rings that suggest long-ago experiments, rituals, or both. Fringe accounts suggest that medieval rulers sometimes engaged in alchemical practices to understand or manipulate natural forces. Historians still argue whether these experiments were scientific, mystical, or performative. You glance at a small vial containing a shimmering, translucent liquid and wonder what knowledge or danger it might hold. The king steps toward a central workbench, his shadow stretching across the floor and flickering like a living flame. One jar contains powdered minerals, another holds dried herbs arranged in intricate patterns. A small bronze astrolabe sits nearby, its polished surface catching moonlight in glints that seem to dance along the walls. Fringe historians claim that some rulers combined astronomy, alchemy, and shadow rituals to create predictive systems. Historians still debate whether these were functional tools or mystical performance. You trudge closer, heart quickening, captivated by the subtle choreography of light, shadow, and material. A faint whisper seems to rise from the stone walls themselves, though you realize it may be the echo of the king's deliberate movements. You notice a shadow curling around a small, hand-carved box on the bench. When the king lifts the lid, a pale, luminescent powder spills slightly, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Fringe accounts suggest that certain powders or substances were believed to enhance perception or communicate with unseen forces. Historians still argue whether these effects were real, symbolic, or theatrical. You hold your breath, sensing the fine line between science and superstition in this secluded chamber. You trudge closer to examine a set of delicate glass flasks, each containing swirling liquids of different colours. The shadows lean in as if reading the subtle patterns within each solution, shifting in response to the king's gestures. A small feather lies across the bench, its tip dipped in liquid, poised as if for a ritualistic illustration. Fringe scholars suggest that some rulers integrated natural observation with alchemical experiments. Historians still debate whether this was practical instruction, mystical exploration, or ceremonial theatre. You shiver slightly, aware that you are witnessing a dance of intellect and ritual that few eyes have seen. The king murmurs under his breath, and shadows respond instantly, curling over the flasks, aligning with certain symbols etched into the bench. You notice a faint shimmer along the edges of the jars, almost like an aura responding to the gestures. Fringe accounts claim that rulers believed in the agency of shadows as assistants in delicate work. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic, performative, or taken literally. You realize that every movement, every glint of light, and every fold of darkness is deliberate, part of a broader choreography that blurs reality and imagination. A soft click echoes as a hidden compartment in the wall slides open, revealing a collection of scrolls bound in silk. The king extracts one, revealing diagrams of celestial movements intertwined with alchemical symbols. Shadows shift to highlight certain sections, curling around glyphs and charts with a precision that seems almost sentient. Fringe accounts suggest that combining astronomy and alchemy in such a secretive way allowed rulers to predict events or interpret omens. Historians still debate whether these practices were genuinely predictive or symbolic exercises. You lean closer, marveling at the intricate interplay of knowledge and ritual. You notice a faint flicker on the wall, where a shadow stretches and curls into a shape resembling a small serpent. The king gestures subtly, and the shadow responds instantly, tracing patterns over the diagrams. Fringe historians suggest that shadows might have been trained to visually emphasize points or illustrate abstract concepts. Historians still argue whether the effect was practical, mystical, or theatrical. You feel a rush of awe. The shadows are not mere reflections, but active participants in the king's work, almost like assistants, advisors, and guardians of knowledge. A faint breeze drifts through a small grate, carrying the scent of sand and distant jasmine. You notice that a shadow curls toward the faint light, elongating in ways that mimic the movement of the king's hand over a diagram. You realize that the chamber itself has become a stage, the king, the shadows, and the alchemical instruments forming a delicate ballet. Fringe accounts describe similar chambers as sites of meditation, observation, and experimentation. Historians still debate whether these practices were scientific, mystical, or performative. You can't stop staring, captivated by the quiet intensity of the scene. By the time you rise, brushing dust from your robes, the king has arranged the flasks and scrolls neatly, shadows retreating to their corners. The chamber feels charged, alive with knowledge, ritual, and possibility. You trudge back toward the spiral staircase, aware that every step, every shadow, every faint glow of moonlight has taught you something new. That observation, patience, and attentiveness transform even the most mundane space into a site of wonder. You carry the memory of this hidden alchemical chamber with you, its secrets lingering, whispering, and waiting to be rediscovered in the quietest corners of your mind. You trudge along a narrow hallway lined with ornate tapestries, the dim moonlight revealing faint figures woven in gold and indigo threads. The images shift slightly as you move, and for a moment, you swear the figures are glancing back at you. The king moves ahead, silent and deliberate, and you follow, feeling the weight of centuries pressing from the walls. Fringe historians suggest that palace tapestries often served as both decoration and storytelling devices, sometimes encoding political or mystical messages. Historians still argue whether these designs were practical, symbolic, or purely aesthetic. You probably won't survive staring too long without feeling a little dizzy from the shifting patterns, but the allure is irresistible. The king stops before a grand tapestry depicting a desert caravan winding across a golden landscape. The shadows detach from the walls and begin to move along the tapestry's figures, stretching and curling to mimic the motions of camels, travellers, and merchants. You watch, fascinated, as the shadows trace invisible paths between stitched dunes and distant fortresses. Fringe accounts claim that shadow manipulation over tapestries was sometimes used as a teaching tool, illustrating routes, tactics, or allegories. Historians still argue whether this was literal instruction or symbolic theatre. You can almost hear the faint hum of a whispered knowledge as the shadows animate the woven scene. You trudge closer, noticing tiny, embroidered details, a falcon perched on a traveller's arm, a sandstorm etched in silver thread, a hidden oasis just beyond the caravan. The shadows respond to each detail, curling around specific figures and stretching over landmarks with intent and precision. Fringe scholars suggest that these interactive displays helped kings visualize strategies or communicate stories. Historians still debate whether the technique was practical, mystical, or ceremonial. You lean in, captivated by the interplay of thread, shadow, and moonlight. The king steps forward, gesturing subtly with a hand, and one shadow detaches entirely from the wall, weaving through the tapestry like a living thread. It pauses over a small figure of a merchant, as if scrutinizing his path, then stretches toward a distant fortress. Fringe accounts suggest that shadows were trained to follow or emphasize certain patterns in tapestries. Historians still argue whether these movements held predictive value or were intended to impress courtiers. You shiver slightly, noticing that the shadows' movements are precise, purposeful, and strangely intelligent. A soft breeze rustles the edges of the tapestries, making the threads quiver and the shadows ripple across the walls. You notice faint glimmers of gold catching the moonlight, tiny sparks that seem almost magical. The king murmurs words that echo softly, and the shadows respond, curling in synchronized arcs. Fringe historians claim that these practices enhance perception, memory, or meditation. Historians still debate whether these rituals were educational, mystical, or performative. You realize that the tapestry is more than art. It is a dynamic canvas, alive with light, shadow, and subtle instruction. You trudge to the edge of the hall, observing a small alcove where a shadow is coiled into the shape of a falcon. The king nods, and the shadow swoops along the woven dunes, landing precisely on an embroidered palm tree. Fringe accounts suggest that symbolic animals in tapestries often interacted with shadows to convey allegorical or practical messages. Historians still argue whether the effect was intentional or serendipitous. You find yourself mesmerized by the delicate choreography, wondering how much of it is instinct, training, or some subtle arcane knowledge. A faint scent of sandalwood drifts from nearby incense burners, mingling with the faint metallic tang of embroidery threads. You notice a tiny figure of a shadowy traveller, almost imperceptible, moving against the main caravan. The king gestures, and it merges with the larger shadow flow, highlighting the subtlety of hidden actions and unseen consequences. Fringe historians propose that palace tapestries served as both narrative and instructional tools. Historians still debate whether such shadow interplay was functional, ceremonial, or theatrical. You lean in, aware that every movement, every shadow, every flicker of light is deliberate. You trudge closer to examine a small embroidered oasis, its silver thread glinting faintly. Shadows gather around the pool, curling in intricate patterns that mirror the ripples of imagined water. The king murmurs softly, guiding their movements, and you realize that this is not mere decoration. It is a lesson, a performance, and perhaps even a meditation. Fringe accounts claim that visualizations like these were used to train observation and memory. Historians still argue whether the intention was practical, mystical, or symbolic. You shiver slightly, aware that the shadows are teaching as much as the king is leading. By the time you step back to observe the entire tapestry, the hall feels transformed. Shadows stretch across walls, archways, and floors, weaving the figures together into a living narrative. You trudge lightly, careful not to disrupt the delicate choreography, but unable to stop marvelling at the interplay of art, history, and subtle instruction. The king watches silently, shadows curling around him like a protective aura. You sense that you have witnessed a secret lesson in observation, strategy, and perception, encoded not in words but in threads and darkness, waiting for those who pay attention to see and understand. You trudge deeper into the palace, leaving the tapestry hall behind, and the air grows warmer, scented faintly of saffron and warmed stone. A faint hum resonates through the corridor, almost musical, like the echo of footsteps long past. The king leads, silent and deliberate, shadows dancing along the walls in response to his movements. Fringe historians suggest that palace architecture was sometimes designed with acoustic properties to enhance meditation, ritual, or secrecy. Historians still debate whether these effects were intentional or coincidental. You probably won't survive ignoring the subtle vibrations in this corridor. They seem to guide your every step. Ahead, a set of carved doors opens into a circular chamber, its dome high above and mosaics glinting in scattered moonlight. The king steps to the centre, and you notice that shadows detach from their usual corners, hovering over the intricate patterns of stars, moons, and celestial creatures. Fringe accounts suggest that circular chambers were often used for astronomical observation, ritual, or secret councils. Historians still argue whether the geometry served practical purposes or symbolic ones. You watch as shadows interact with the mosaic, curling over certain constellations, emphasizing some stars while avoiding others. The king kneels near a central mosaic depicting the night sky, the patterns of planets and moons arranged in impossible geometries. A shadow stretches across the floor, tracing constellations with delicate arcs that seem almost sentient. Fringe historians claim that shadow-guided observation could aid in tracking celestial movements or interpreting omens. Historians still argue whether these practices were scientific, mystical, or theatrical. You notice subtle glints of gold embedded in the tiles, catching the moonlight in fleeting flashes that make the stars appear to shimmer. You trudge closer to examine the mosaic, feeling the subtle undulations of the tiles beneath your fingertips. Tiny inscriptions are etched along the edges, names, dates, cryptic symbols, and whimsical sketches of animals and humans interacting with celestial bodies. Shadows respond instantly, curling around specific sections, highlighting patterns, and even merging briefly with the king's own shadow. Fringe accounts suggest that interactive mosaics were used to teach astronomy, philosophy, and ritual combined. Historians still debate whether they were functional or ceremonial. You feel a thrill, realizing that you're witnessing a multi-dimensional dialogue between light, shadow, and knowledge. A faint breeze stirs, carrying the scent of night-blooming jasmine from an open balcony. You notice the shadow's edges flicker in response, stretching and folding in ways that seem deliberate. The king murmurs a series of low words, almost inaudible, guiding their movements like a conductor directing a subtle symphony. Fringe historians suggest that shadow manipulation in such chambers may have been an early form of symbolic communication. Historians still argue whether these techniques were intended for instruction, meditation, or political theatre. You lean closer, entranced by the careful, almost invisible choreography. You trudge around the edge of the chamber, noticing a tiny pool at the centre reflecting the moonlight. Shadows gather around it, curling and twisting, tracing faint ripples on the water's surface. The king dips a finger into the pool, causing the reflections to shift, and the shadows respond instantly, accentuating the changes with delicate curves and arcs. Fringe accounts propose that reflective surfaces enhanced shadow communication and perception. Historians still debate whether this was mystical, practical, or purely ceremonial. You realize that even the smallest ripple in water can orchestrate a dance of light and darkness here. A soft metallic clink draws your attention to a small stand with polished instruments, a brass astrolabe, an orrery, and a set of delicate compasses. Shadows lean over them, aligning with dials and gears as though reading them independently. Fringe historians claim these instruments were integrated with shadow guidance to visualize celestial movements. Historians still argue whether such guidance was literal, symbolic, or theatrical. You notice the faintest shimmer along the orrery's planets, the reflection seemingly synchronized with shadow movements. The king steps back, surveying the chamber, and for the first time, you notice a subtle smile. His shadow stretches wide, almost protective, curling around the edges of the central mosaic and instruments. Fringe accounts suggest that rulers use shadow presence to assert control, influence perception, or meditate on cosmic order. Historians still debate whether this was performative, spiritual, or psychological. You feel a quiet thrill, realizing that the shadows are not merely tools, they are active participants in this nocturnal symphony of knowledge. You trudge closer to a mosaic depicting the moon cradling a small caravan of travellers. Shadows drift over the figures, curling in arcs and loops that seem almost narrative, emphasizing journeys, choices, and fates. Fringe historians suggest these shadow-enhanced mosaics could teach observation, memory, or philosophical reasoning. Historians still argue whether the practice was practical, mystical, or theatrical. You pause, captivated, sensing that every subtle movement carries meaning, a dialogue between time, knowledge, and perception. By the time you leave the chamber, brushing dust lightly from your hands, you realize that the palace is a living archive. Shadows, mosaics, instruments, and rituals converge to create a dynamic, interactive environment. You trudge along the marble corridors, aware that every corner of the palace carries lessons hidden in subtle details, waiting for those patient enough to notice, to observe, and to understand. The night feels alive, every flicker, every fold, and every shimmer a reminder that knowledge in this palace is never merely static, it dances. You trudge through a quiet corridor, the soft echo of your footsteps mingling with the distant murmur of fountains. The walls here are lined with polished wood, inlaid with tiny golden patterns that glint faintly in the moonlight. Shadows stretch along the edges, curling and folding as if observing you, and you realize they have grown almost sentient in their anticipation. Fringe historians suggest that some palace corridors were designed to channel light and shadow, to influence perception or meditation. Historians still debate whether this was deliberate or coincidental. You probably won't survive ignoring the subtle cues, because the walls seem to whisper if you aren't paying attention. Ahead, the king pauses before a small, arched doorway partially hidden behind heavy drapes. Beyond, a chamber opens up, its floor covered with sand from a nearby courtyard, raked into elaborate patterns. The air smells faintly of mint and cedar, mingling with dust and the faint tang of metal. Fringe accounts claim that sand-filled rooms were sometimes used for divination, planning, or shadow exercises. Historians still argue whether these practices were mystical, practical, or ceremonial. You trudge forward carefully, mindful of each step, feeling that even the smallest misplacement of foot could disturb centuries of silent communication. The king kneels in the centre, hands hovering over the sand, and shadows begin to stretch along the carefully raked lines. They curl over dunes and miniature oases, tracing patterns that seem almost alive, and you realize that this is no ordinary garden. It is a stage, a lesson, a living text. Fringe scholars propose that kings may have used shadow play over sand to simulate battles, trade routes, or social hierarchies. Historians still argue whether the practice was instructional or ritualistic. You lean closer, mesmerized by the subtle interplay of light, sand, and darkness. You notice a small fountain trickling quietly in one corner, the water catching the moonlight and scattering tiny reflections across the sand. Shadows respond instantly, flowing over the water and joining the patterns in the sand, creating a delicate choreography. Fringe accounts suggest that reflective surfaces were used to enhance perception and observation. Historians still debate whether the effect was practical, mystical, or theatrical. You shiver slightly, feeling that every ripple, every flicker of shadow is deliberately orchestrated. A faint movement draws your gaze, a tiny figure etched into the sand, perhaps representing a traveller or messenger. The king traces the figure with a fingertip, and the shadows curl protectively around it, highlighting its path through the miniature dunes. Fringe historians propose that such tiny details encoded information about journeys, strategies, or philosophical ideas. Historians still argue whether the markings were purely symbolic or carried actionable knowledge. You feel the weight of history under your fingertips, aware that the sands hold both story and instruction. You trudge around the edge of the chamber, noticing small ridges that create optical illusions when moonlight hits them. Shadows curl and stretch over these ridges, emphasizing depth and movement in a silent narrative. Fringe accounts claim that these effects were intended to teach spatial awareness or strategic thinking. Historians still argue whether the technique was practical, meditative, or theatrical. You lean closer, sensing that even the smallest ridge has meaning, and that the king's interaction with shadows is a language in itself. The king gestures subtly, and one shadow detaches from the wall, curling over the sand in a series of loops that mirror the night sky. Stars and constellations reflected in the sand create a mesmerizing overlay, linking celestial patterns with terrestrial ones. Fringe scholars suggest that this might have been used to visualize astrological or strategic alignments. Historians still debate whether these shadowed overlays were symbolic or functional. You find yourself holding your breath, caught between awe and disbelief as the night unfolds its quiet lesson. A soft breeze drifts through the open door, carrying the scent of jasmine and distant desert sands. You notice a small, unexpected disruption in the sand, a tiny footprint not matching the king's or your own. Shadows gather around it, curling protectively, emphasizing its significance without explanation. Fringe accounts suggest that such anomalies were deliberate markers, signaling messages or warnings. Historians still argue whether these signs were practical, mystical, or performative. You shiver, realizing that the garden is not merely a visual exercise but an active dialogue between human, shadow, and environment. You trudge closer to the central fountain, the reflections dancing in complex patterns on the walls and ceiling. The king dips a finger into the water, and the shadows respond immediately, curling and stretching over both sand and liquid. Fringe historians propose that movement over multiple mediums, sand, water, shadow, enhanced cognitive or spiritual engagement. Historians still argue whether the practice was mystical, educational, or theatrical. You feel an unusual calm, as though the chamber itself is teaching observation, patience, and interpretation. By the time you step back, brushing sand from your robes, you understand that this hidden garden is more than a lesson in geometry or strategy. It is an immersive meditation, a silent narrative written in sand, water, and shadow. You trudge slowly toward the exit, aware that every ripple, curve, and fold has been a conversation, and that the palace is not merely a building but a living archive, alive with secrets for those patient enough to observe. Shadows follow quietly behind, curling and stretching in silent acknowledgement, as if inviting you to return, to watch, and to learn again. You trudge through a narrow passage leading from the sand chamber, the scent of cedar and mint lingering faintly in the cool night air. The king moves ahead, silent, his shadow stretching across the polished walls in long, deliberate arcs. You notice the faint hum of the palace settling around you, a vibration almost musical, resonating softly through stone and wood. Fringe historians suggest that certain corridors were designed to channel sound and shadow to enhance perception or meditation. Historians still debate whether the effect was intentional or coincidental. You probably won't survive ignoring the subtle cues in this passage, because the walls seem to guide every step. Ahead, a carved doorway opens into the Hall of Mirrors, a space filled with angled glass panels reflecting candlelight, moonlight, and shadows in complex overlapping patterns. You pause, mesmerized, as your own shadow fragments and multiplies, stretching across the floors and walls in ways that feel almost alive. Fringe accounts claim that mirrored halls were used to teach spatial awareness, reflection, and illusion. Historians still argue whether they were intended as playful spectacles, meditative tools, or practical exercises. The king steps forward, and his shadow bends and curves, interacting with the mirrors in deliberate sequences, creating a subtle choreography of light and darkness. You trudge closer, noticing faint inscriptions etched into the mirror frames, words so tiny that you almost miss them: advice, aphorisms, and cryptic notes for those who observed closely. Shadows gather around certain frames, curling to emphasize phrases or patterns, as if reading aloud silently. Fringe scholars suggest that these interactive spaces trained attention and observation, blending art, architecture, and ritual. Historians still argue whether the design was functional, symbolic, or theatrical. You feel your own awareness heighten, each reflection demanding careful attention. The king gestures subtly, and one shadow detaches entirely from the floor, weaving among the mirrors like a living ribbon. It pauses over a particularly ornate panel, tracing patterns of light and reflecting images from other parts of the hall. Fringe accounts suggest that shadows might have been trained to highlight or interpret complex visual cues. Historians still debate whether these movements conveyed practical information or were purely performative. You hold your breath, captivated by the silent dialogue of motion and reflection. A soft breeze drifts through an open window, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and distant desert sands. The mirrored surfaces catch the movement, scattering it across the room, and the shadows respond instantly, twisting and stretching in delicate arcs. Fringe historians propose that mirrored halls enhanced perceptual and meditative abilities. Historians still argue whether these effects were mystical, educational, or theatrical. You notice your own shadow responding in unexpected ways, stretching beyond your body's boundaries, as though learning from the choreography around you. You trudge toward a small pool at the center of the hall, its water reflecting the intricate patterns of light and shadow across the mirrored walls. The king dips a finger into the water, creating ripples that echo through reflections and shadows alike. Fringe accounts suggest that water and mirrors together enhance both observation and meditative practice. Historians still debate whether the practice was symbolic, functional, or theatrical. You watch intently as shadows ripple across the floor and walls, forming fleeting shapes that almost seem sentient. A faint metallic clink draws your attention to a set of small instruments arranged on a nearby ledge. Polished brass compasses, a miniature astrolabe, and delicate glass vials. Shadows curl around these tools, tracing curves and arcs in synchrony with the king's gestures. Fringe historians claim that such instruments integrated with shadow and mirror play enhanced cognitive or spiritual exercises. Historians still argue whether the effect was practical, mystical, or ceremonial. You lean closer, sensing that even the smallest instrument is part of a larger choreography, a living lesson in observation and precision. The king pauses near a mosaic embedded in the floor, depicting a night sky with planets and stars in impossible geometries. Shadows stretch and fold, highlighting specific constellations and celestial alignments. Fringe accounts suggest that shadows in combination with mirrors and mosaics were used to teach astronomy, philosophy, and ritual simultaneously. Historians still debate whether these practices were functional, symbolic, or performative. You feel a quiet reverence, aware that every movement, every flicker of light is deliberate, encoded with meaning for those willing to pay attention. You trudge along the edges of the hall, noticing tiny inscriptions along the mirror's edges, cryptic notes and whimsical sketches that interact with the reflections. Shadows respond, curling around the markings, emphasizing, tracing, and sometimes correcting. Fringe scholars suggest that these inscriptions were designed to enhance learning, perception, and memory. Historians still argue whether their effect was practical, mystical, or theatrical. You feel that the room itself has become a teacher, the mirrors, water, and shadows forming an immersive lesson in observation and subtlety. By the time you leave the Hall of Mirrors, brushing faint dust from your hands, you feel a sense of wonder and quiet humility. Shadows linger at the edges of your vision, as if escorting you back through the corridors, and the palace feels alive with knowledge, ritual, and subtle instruction. You trudge slowly, aware that every flicker, every fold, and every shimmer has taught you more than words ever could, leaving you both awed and quietly exhausted, carrying the whispers of shadows with you as you move deeper into the night. You trudge along a long corridor whose walls are lined with bronze reliefs depicting battles, trade caravans, and celestial events. The king walks ahead, silent, and you notice your shadow stretching along the polished floor, curling in response to his own. Fringe historians suggest that reliefs in palace corridors often encoded political messages or recorded historical events. Historians still debate whether the intention was purely informational, symbolic, or performative. You probably won't survive ignoring the subtle gestures embedded in the bronze. They almost whisper if you look too quickly. Ahead, a narrow doorway opens into the Hall of Keys, a room filled with shelves and hooks, each holding dozens of intricately wrought metal keys. The faint scent of iron mingles with the lingering fragrance of incense, and shadows curl along the edges of the keys, stretching like sentinels. Fringe accounts claim that such rooms often contained keys to private chambers, archives, or secret compartments. Historians still argue whether their presence was purely practical or symbolic, representing authority and access. You trudge closer, noticing tiny inscriptions engraved into each key, numbers, symbols, and subtle markings whose meaning is not immediately clear. The king moves to a central pedestal, placing his hands lightly on a large key with an intricate pattern of interlocking gears and celestial symbols. Shadows gather around the key, stretching and folding in response to his gestures, emphasizing its significance. Fringe historians suggest that keys were sometimes paired with shadow rituals to reinforce authority, memory, or knowledge. Historians still argue whether these practices were functional, mystical, or theatrical. You watch intently as the king lifts the key, aligning it with a small lock embedded in the pedestal, a precise movement that seems almost ritualistic. You trudge closer to examine smaller keys scattered across the floor, noticing subtle differences in design, weight, and texture. Shadows hover over the keys, curling around specific ones, as if choosing or highlighting importance. Fringe accounts suggest that the interaction between shadows and keys may have been a form of silent instruction, emphasizing hierarchy, access, or strategy. Historians still debate whether this was practical or symbolic. You notice a small key that glints faintly in the moonlight, its shape reminiscent of a crescent moon intertwined with tiny stars. The king slides the large key into the pedestal's lock, turning it slowly. A soft click echoes through the chamber, and a hidden compartment slides open, revealing a set of manuscripts bound in silk. Shadows gather around the newly revealed treasures, curling protectively and highlighting sections with deliberate precision. Fringe scholars claim that this technique enhanced observation and memory, providing subtle guidance to those who could interpret it. Historians still argue whether it was instructional, mystical, or performative. You lean closer, captivated by the silent choreography of hands, keys, and shadows. You trudge toward a small alcove where a shadow stretches along the floor in the shape of a hand, pointing toward a particular scroll. The king lifts it and spreads it open, revealing intricate diagrams of trade routes, celestial alignments, and coded messages. Shadows curl along specific lines, emphasizing patterns and pathways that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Fringe accounts suggest that shadow emphasis was an integral part of interpreting complex texts. Historians still debate whether it was functional or ceremonial. You shiver slightly, aware that this is a lesson in attention, patience, and observation more than in reading itself. A soft breeze drifts through an open window, carrying the scent of jasmine and distant desert sands. You notice shadows shifting subtly in response, curling over the manuscripts, highlighting particular symbols and words. Fringe historians propose that interactive shadow observation enhanced memory, comprehension, or spiritual engagement. Historians still argue whether the effect was mystical, educational, or performative. You watch as a tiny shadow detaches, tracing a line of stars on the manuscript in synchrony with the king's finger. You trudge around the chamber, observing faintly etched symbols on the walls, numbers, letters, and abstract shapes. Shadows lean over them, curling to emphasize patterns and alignments. Fringe accounts claim these inscriptions, in combination with keys and shadows, formed an interactive learning or interpretive system. Historians still debate whether this was practical, symbolic, or theatrical. You feel your awareness heighten, realizing that every shadow, every flicker of light, and every small gesture carries meaning. The king pauses, surveying the room, and you notice a subtle smile as his shadow stretches across the floor and coils protectively around the manuscripts. Fringe scholars suggest that shadow engagement reinforced authority, comprehension, and perception. Historians still argue whether these interactions were mystical, performative, or practical. You feel a quiet awe, sensing that the room itself is alive with a layered language of light, shadow, and subtle instruction. By the time you leave the Hall of Keys, brushing faint dust from your robes, you carry with you a growing understanding of subtlety, observation, and authority. Shadows follow you quietly, stretching and curling along the corridor, leaving you aware that even the simplest object, a key, a manuscript, a flicker of light, can hold lessons for those patient enough to observe. You trudge onward, deeper into the palace, the night alive with whispers, secrets, and the soft choreography of shadow and perception. You trudge along the final wing of the palace, the corridor narrowing, walls adorned with delicate mosaics depicting celestial scenes and courtly life. Moonlight spills through high, arched windows, illuminating tiny fragments of gold and silver embedded in the tiles. Shadows curl along the mosaics, stretching and bending as though reading each detail aloud. Fringe historians suggest that palace mosaics were used not just for decoration, but to encode philosophical, astronomical, or political knowledge. Historians still debate whether these designs were primarily instructional, symbolic, or aesthetic. You probably won't survive ignoring the subtle cues. Every curve and glint carries meaning. Ahead, a grand doorway opens into the Hall of Echoes, a cavernous chamber where sound bounces in intricate patterns. You step inside and notice that your own footsteps create faint, lingering whispers that intertwine with the low hum of shadows curling along the walls. Fringe accounts suggest that echo chambers were used for secret communications, musical experimentation, or meditation. Historians still argue whether their construction was deliberate or coincidental. The king moves forward, and shadows respond instantly, stretching to emphasize acoustic lines that you hadn't realized existed. You trudge closer to the centre of the hall, noticing faint geometric patterns etched into the stone floor. Shadows curl along the lines, highlighting angles, intersections, and curves, almost like a silent lecture in geometry. Fringe historians propose that shadow-enhanced patterns in echo chambers were used to teach spatial reasoning and observation. Historians still debate whether these designs were practical, mystical, or ceremonial. You lean down, tracing the patterns with a fingertip, aware that even the smallest line could change your perception of the space. The king raises a hand, and one shadow detaches, weaving along the floor and walls in complex loops, stretching toward high arches and suspended lanterns. You notice the faint glimmer of reflected light from the lanterns, mingling with the shadows to create miniature constellations on the walls. Fringe accounts claim that interactive light and shadow could enhance meditation, memory, or ceremonial ritual. Historians still argue whether these effects were functional or symbolic. You shiver slightly, realizing the space itself is a living lesson in observation and awareness. You trudge toward a small alcove, where a shallow pool mirrors the high ceiling and intricate mosaics. Shadows curl over the water, forming patterns that echo the arches above, creating a delicate overlay of reflection and form. Fringe historians suggest that mirrored surfaces amplified shadow interactions for interpretive or meditative purposes. Historians still debate whether these effects were mystical, practical, or performative. You notice that even the faintest ripple changes the choreography of light and darkness, and the king adjusts his gestures to guide the shadows accordingly. A soft breeze drifts through an open window, carrying the scent of jasmine and desert sand. Shadows respond instantly, curling and stretching in arcs that trace both the mosaics and your own reflection in the pool. Fringe accounts propose that such dynamic interplay between light, water, and shadow-enhanced cognitive, spiritual, or observational skills. Historians still argue whether the effect was functional, ceremonial, or mystical. You feel a calm fascination, as though the chamber itself is quietly instructing you in subtlety and perception. You trudge around the edges of the pool, noticing tiny inscriptions along the walls, celestial symbols, cryptic scripts, and whimsical sketches. Shadows hover over specific areas, emphasizing shapes and lines, almost as if correcting or annotating them. Fringe historians claim that this interplay of inscriptions, shadows, and reflections formed a living, interactive lesson. Historians still debate whether it was symbolic, educational, or theatrical. You lean closer, marvelling at the depth and intentionality of every subtle movement and reflection. The king steps back, surveying the hall, and you notice a faint smile as his shadow stretches protectively across the mosaics, the pool, and the reflections. Fringe accounts suggest that shadow interaction reinforced authority, observation, and perception. Historians still argue whether these effects were practical, mystical, or ceremonial. You feel a quiet thrill, realizing that you have been walking through a palace alive with instruction, ritual, and subtle communication, more profound than any lecture or text could convey. You trudge slowly toward the exit, aware that each reflection, ripple, and curled shadow has left a subtle impression on your mind. The Hall of Echoes, like the rest of the palace, is not just a space but a living archive, where perception, attention, and quiet observation are as important as the texts, mosaics, and instruments themselves. Shadows follow quietly, curling around doorways and arches, a reminder that the palace holds its lessons in light, dark, and subtle movement. By the time you step into the outer corridor, brushing dust from your robes, you carry with you a heightened awareness, a quiet reverence for the interplay of shadow, light, and space. You trudge onward, deeper into the night, knowing that each subtle gesture, every reflection, and every curl of shadow has been part of an invisible dialogue between you, the king, and the palace itself. You trudge through the final corridor of the palace, the faint scent of jasmine and warmed stone lingering in the air. The moonlight through the high windows paints elongated shadows that twist and fold along the floor, ceiling, and walls. The king walks ahead, silent, and his shadow stretches protectively across the marble, curling like an attentive companion. Fringe historians suggest that final corridors and exit passages were deliberately designed to leave visitors with a lingering sense of awe or contemplation. Historians still debate whether these effects were intentional, symbolic, or purely aesthetic. You probably won't survive ignoring the subtle cues. The space itself seems to whisper its final lessons. Ahead, a grand door opens onto a rooftop terrace, the city sprawled below like a map of gold and stone. Shadows cling to your heels, stretching toward the city's lights, blending with the faint silhouette of minarets, towers, and winding streets. The air is cool, carrying the scent of distant spices, baked bread, and the faint tang of the river. Fringe accounts suggest that palace terraces serve not only as observation points, but also as spaces for reflection and meditation. Historians still argue whether their placement was strategic, symbolic, or aesthetic. You trudge forward, sensing that the shadows are here to guide, not to follow. The king steps to the terrace's edge, pointing toward the horizon where the crescent moon hovers above the desert beyond the city. Shadows stretch outward, emphasizing the contours of rooftops and distant sand dunes, creating a delicate interplay of darkness and moonlight. Fringe historians propose that rulers use shadow and light to teach perspective, observation, and foresight. Historians still debate whether this was practical, symbolic, or ceremonial. You lean on the balustrade, mesmerized by the subtle choreography of shadows merging with the world outside. A soft breeze stirs your hair, carrying the faint scent of jasmine and distant desert winds. The king gestures, and a shadow detaches, weaving across the terrace floor, outlining distant minarets and bridges, creating a delicate map of the city below. Fringe accounts suggest that shadows acted as silent guides for observation, memory, and navigation. Historians still argue whether these methods were mystical, practical, or performative. You trudge slowly, aware that every flicker of darkness, every curl of shadow, carries information and instruction beyond words. You notice tiny inscriptions etched into the terrace stone, numbers, letters, and cryptic symbols, almost invisible in the moonlight. Shadows hover over them, curling in intricate patterns, highlighting points of interest as if guiding your eyes to the subtleties you might otherwise miss. Fringe scholars suggest that this interactive combination of shadow, inscription, and observation formed an immersive lesson in attentiveness and perception. Historians still debate whether the effect was practical, symbolic, or theatrical. You shiver slightly, captivated by the quiet intelligence of the space. The king moves to a small fountain at the terrace's centre, the water reflecting moonlight across the stone floor. Shadows ripple across the water, stretching, folding, and dancing in response to his gestures. Fringe accounts claim that water surfaces amplified shadow instruction, enhancing meditation, observation, or perception. Historians still argue whether these practices were functional, mystical, or performative. You lean closer, feeling an unusual calm as the palace, the terrace, and the shadows teach in silence, without a single word. A faint murmur rises from the city below, the distant echo of voices, footsteps, and life. Shadows curl protectively along the balustrade and the fountain, accentuating the edges of moonlight, creating a delicate boundary between observation and interaction. Fringe historians propose that shadows were used to teach spatial awareness, emotional perception, and subtlety of attention. Historians still debate whether this was symbolic, practical, or mystical. You realize that even the faintest movement of light and dark carries lessons for those patient enough to watch. You trudge to the terrace's far edge, gazing toward the horizon where desert sands meet the night sky. Shadows stretch over the terrace floor, merging with distant darkness, creating a tapestry of perception, reflection, and quiet contemplation. Fringe accounts suggest that such rooftop terraces integrated shadow, moonlight, and observation to teach awareness of both space and time. Historians still argue whether these effects were practical, symbolic, or performative. You feel a profound stillness, as though the night itself is instructing you in patience, observation, and subtlety. The king stands silently, watching the moon and the distant city, shadows curling around him protectively. You trudge slowly to a corner, observing that every movement, ripple, and reflection is intentional, a subtle dialogue between ruler, palace, and observer. Fringe historians claim that this culmination of shadow, light, architecture, and ritual provided lessons in awareness, perception, and cognition. Historians still debate whether the practice was mystical, ceremonial, or practical. You feel a sense of quiet reverence, aware that you have witnessed the palace's secrets unfold in layers, shadows, and subtle choreography. By the time you step toward the staircase leading down, brushing faint dust from your robes, you carry with you the memory of the shadows, mosaics, inscriptions, and reflective surfaces. You trudge slowly, mindful of each step, aware that the palace, the king, and the night have left a lasting impression. A quiet meditation on observation, subtlety, and the interplay of light and darkness. The whispers of shadows linger, guiding you even as you descend, leaving you with a sense of awe, curiosity, and quiet calm. You pause at the bottom of the staircase, letting your eyes adjust to the dim candlelight of the outer hall. The palace has fallen into a gentle quiet, shadows receding, curling into corners, leaving only the soft glow of lanterns and the faint hum of the night. You trudge slowly, savouring each breath, feeling the coolness of the stone beneath your feet, the faint scent of jasmine lingering in the air. Your mind drifts, reflecting on the subtle choreography of shadows, light, mosaics, inscriptions, and reflections, the invisible dialogue that guided your journey. Every flicker of darkness, every ripple of reflected moonlight feels like a whisper, a gentle nudge toward mindfulness, patience, and careful observation. You feel your muscles relax, shoulders releasing tension, your heartbeat slowing, as though the palace itself is breathing with you. The layers of ritual, perception, and shadowed instruction blend into a soft hum of understanding, quieting the mind and inviting stillness. Fringe or fact, history or legend, it no longer matters. The experience leaves a lingering calm. As you trudge toward the outer gardens, the cool night air washes over you, carrying distant scents of flowers, spices, and sand. Shadows flicker softly among the hedges, tracing paths of your movement, echoing gentle lessons learned without a single word spoken. You pause, noticing the moon's reflection on a small fountain, the water barely rippling, shimmering like silver. You exhale slowly, letting the peace of the moment settle deeply, feeling both present and adrift in time, a quiet observer of the palace's nocturnal wisdom. The night stretches endlessly, soft and forgiving, holding you in its gentle embrace. You trudge no further, simply standing, letting the calm linger, letting shadows fold back into themselves, letting every lesson sink into quiet memory. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let the gentle rhythm of your breath carry you into the serene quiet of your own night. Peace settles softly, shadows retreat, and you drift, carrying the palace's whispered wisdom into dreams.